Welcome, everybody, to Exploring Reality. I'm super excited about this stream in particular because we're going to talk about some controversial stuff that I don't think should be controversial. And I think it's just really fun. We're going to explore a lot of stuff about God, time, his foreknowledge, all sorts of fun stuff. Before we get started, I just want to thank everybody who has started supporting in the middle of our fundraising push here. For those that don't know, you can support Exploring Reality through Patreon or through the parent ministry that kind of like funnels the money that I do here. I can't find my words there. So you can find me on Patreon again at Exploring Reality. Here are all the tiers. Your support is instrumental in what I do. And yeah, just please consider doing that, especially just with the fact that I've had the health issues recently. I haven't been able to do like the extra work that put more money on the table for my family. So every little bit helps. Thank you so much. And we also have, I want Dr. Ryan Mullins to kind of plug something here too that you're kind of putting together. So why don't you kind of take it away there?
So I'm a part of this new online master's program at the University of Lucerne in Switzerland. And so it's a master's program in philosophy, theology, and religions. So you get this robust education in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic philosophy. So we'll go through like the history of Western philosophical theology all the way to the present day debates. We've got a lot of really cool people that are teaching for the program. We've got people like Richard Cross, Linda Zagzebski, Peter Adamson. If you don't know who some of these people are, then you don't actually know anything about the world of philosophy and theology. But, if you pretend like you actually know stuff about philosophy and theology, but you don't actually know this stuff, then you need to join this program. You've got till the end of August to apply for this coming semester. Otherwise, you'll have to wait a little bit and try to get into the second semester. It's a European program. So what you're getting is when you're enrolling in this program, each class you take, you're getting a personal tutor assigned to you. And I'm in charge of the tutors, and I'm also one of the tutors as well. So you might get to, I don't know, if you're lucky, I might do some personal tutoring with you. Otherwise, I might just pawn you off on someone else. So,
Man, if I had the time and money, I would do it. that's plus I have 3 kids.
Yeah, 3 kids. It's a lot of stuff on your plate.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, well, this is just a really funny comment before we get started. Because you and I were talking about off the stream is Ryan. I once met you on the train from Lucas, St. Andrews to Edinburgh. Seems like a pretty cool guy. Thanks for being nice to me.
I'm trying to think. I wonder if this guy, like, I remember I was in a terrible mood, and I was just sitting with Joanna Leidenhag, and I was complaining about how I hated the theology seminar because I was like, I just want someone to say something that's at least true or false. That was like the minimum threshold for me. I remember complaining about this. So I wonder if this is the guy that sat there very quietly, like waiting for a moment to be like, I really like this sort of this stuff. And I was like, I think I made a bad impression, but I don't know.
Seth, well, Seth, if you're the guy that he's alluding to, let us know. Because if that's the case, you did not leave a bad impression.
That's good. Because I was in a really grumpy mood that day. So
it's actually really funny. I have a lot of stories like that too. I was at a conference one time and somebody came up to me. Okay, this is one of my favorite things. Somebody came up to me at a conference one time and said, "Oh, you're Mr. Reality." Instead of fan. I thought it was funny.
That's great.
All right, let's get on track. So today we're gonna do arguments for, and we should probably define these terms after this. Arguments for absolute theory of time over like a relational theory of time. Arguments for A theory / B theory, if we want to get into that, why that's important. And then we'll kind of talk about, if we have time, we can talk about some of the biblical data if you want to. And then how this all relates to like God's foreknowledge, what this might mean for different things, and we'll take some questions at the end. Does that still sound like a good plan to you?
Yeah, this sounds good.
Cool. So, you're the philosopher. What do those terms mean, and like why are these important?
Yeah, so when we're talking about God's relationship to time, we're talking about an issue that actually I think is really fundamental to theology, because the entire Christian story, the entire biblical narrative, is a story of in the beginning. And you've got this being that existed somehow from everlasting to everlasting prior to the foundation of the world. So, and then the story goes, and there's all this stuff that's promised that's going to happen in the future. So time, you really can't get out of it when you're looking at the entirety of Christian theology. So so what's odd is when you look at the average Christian theologian, they ask the question, "What is time?" and they go, "I don't know," and then they just carry on. And I'm like, what is that? It's annoying. So yeah. Yeah, so you see this in St. Augustine. So St. Augustine's like, yeah, I know what time is unless you ask me, and then I don't know, and I'm like,
Yeah.
okay. And then people like repeat it over and over again. Even like Pierre Gassendi, who affirms what's called the absolute theory of time, which we'll get to in a second, he also has a quote like this where he's like, yeah, most theologians we don't like to talk about what is time, because it gets so complicated so fast. But then he like goes on to actually do it, unlike what Augustine does. So yeah, so let's get into it. So the main theory that a lot of people today affirm is what's called the relational theory of time. The relational theory of time actually it says time's not a thing at all.
Yeah.
So when we're doing our ontology, we come up with these inventories of like, here's the list of all the things that I believe exist: chairs, tables, souls, God, angels, numbers, and people quibble about this stuff. I want to say time should be on that list. And that's what the absolute theory says, is time is going to be on that list of my ontological inventory.
Yeah.
The relational theory goes, no, not at all. I'm like, okay, well, why? And they're like, well, because we can reduce time away to non-temporal entities. And we do this all the time in other areas. So there's a lot of this stuff going on in what's called social ontology, where people are going, are maybe groups are actual like things that should be on our ontological inventory. And like groups of people, that should be no. A group of people just is a collection of people. Like there's no thing that's groups above and beyond that. Like it's fully reducible to groups. And there's a bunch of people now today want to go, maybe it's not like that. I'm like, this is weird. People want to do this with time. They want to go, time's not a thing. We can just reduce it down to something else. And that something else is usually change or events. Those are the two main categories. Now, here's the problem. Here's the first problem with this view. The first problem with this view is it's so incredibly ill-defined. So John Earman actually has this really interesting remark. He says, there are almost as many versions of the relationalism as there are relationalists. So like trying to figure out exactly what the view is difficult because most people don't bother to define it. And W.H. Newton Smith makes a similar comment. He says, it's been such an attractive view to your average physicist and philosopher. They didn't even bother articulating it or defending it. They're just kind of like, yeah, it's just a relationship between stuff and junk. And you're like, what's going on here? But here's a serious problem that the views face. They face a series of circularity problems. So when you're trying to reduce time away to something non-temporal, you need to find a good candidate of something that's not temporal, something that can explain time, all of our time talk, without introducing time into the story. So one common example is change. We'll say time is just a relationship between change. I'm like, okay, cool. Now tell me what change is. And whatever story you tell about what change is, you better not introduce any temporal notions in there, because you're trying to reduce away temporal notions to non-temporal things. And when you ask what change is, your average philosopher, the average like textbook definition is things being in incompatible ways at different moments of time. And so you're like, yeah. So this is not a good start, if you're like, okay, Polly, what are we doing here? So that's one problem. Another way you could try to go though is go, well, maybe it's a relationship between events. And you're like, okay, cool. What are events? Events are supposed to be these non-temporal things. How do we construct events in order to create moments? This is what the strategy is. Well, when you're looking at different definitions of events, people will say we create a moment, or we construct a moment, logically construct a moment out of events by collecting together all the events that are simultaneous with each other. And I'm like, simultaneous with each other? That sounds like a temporal notion.
Yeah.
Okay, you snuck time back in. This isn't good. And then we start looking at different definitions of events. You'll see these things like E.J. Lowe will talk about how an event is a temporal particular.
Yeah.
And I'm like, temporal? You're like, hang on. You're like, we're supposed to be talking, like trying to reduce time to non-temporal things. Like this is not off to a good start. And then you look at all the definitions of an event itself, and it gets really bad because all the definitions of an event are usually saying an event is a substance having a property at a time, like at a moment of time. And you're like, okay, so you snuck back time in again. So every attempt I'm aware of keeps doing this. It keeps introducing temporal notions like before and after into the story, or it starts introducing these really more substantive concepts of simultaneity, moments,
Yeah.
time, and you're like, you're supposed to be reducing this away.
Yeah.
What's going on here?
Yeah. So the basic idea here is just all the ways to try to describe time on the relational view. The goal is to reduce it down to something that is not temporal, but every single time we try to define it or explain it, it comes out in temporal notions. But if it's the case that it's not logically identical to something temporal, like a substance that's temporal, well, then you should be able to do those things, but you can't.
That's yeah.
Okay.
That's the basic problem. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So what other people do then is they'll go, well, then this is just a dead end. Like this isn't going to work. And there's a lot of more like there's more bells and whistles you can add on to the relational theory. There's more moves you can try to make, but I think each one of them ends up introducing some kind of circularity where
Yeah.
you got time snuck into the story, and you're like, okay.
Yeah.
So what the absolute theory does is goes, now let's look at what we can call the temporal landscape. Let's look at all the phenomena in reality that we need to try to capture. We need to capture the ubiquity of time because it seems like time is everywhere. It's not like you're wandering across the universe and you just stumble upon like a section of it that's timeless. Like that's not a thing. Like,
Yeah. How quick question that came up
Mhm.
in my head. This is something I was thinking about actually today when I was walking. I
Mhm.
was just walking my dog, and I went from "Wow, it's really hot outside. I hate this" to "I wonder what it's like on Mars."
Mhm.
Okay, so the connection here is, um, depending on how you identify physics, time, or like, well, let's not even go with the Mars example. Like, if you're just driving really, really fast, at some point, like that time actually starts to dilate according
Mhm.
to your speed, kind of a thing.
Mhm.
Does that affect the like ubiquitousness of time that you're referring to, or like an argument that you'd be making for, or anything like that?
It shouldn't,
Okay.
because you'll still have time going on there. So if you really do think that special theory relativity is true and accurately describes fundamental reality, we'll ignore the fact that it's a false theory and it doesn't do any of those things. But let's say it's true for a second,
Yeah, yeah,
because we're going to stick with popular physics.
yeah,
So what you'd have is you just have when you enter into like a different inertial reference frame or something like that,
yeah.
your clocks get really screwed up, but the clocks are still going though,
Hmm.
because on the way that Einstein developed it, time exists if and only if a clock exists. Like a clock just is time. That's it.
Yeah,
Time just is our measuring devices, and you can have a measuring device somewhere else. It just gets screwed up when you're moving from different frames. Um, so it still have the ubiquity of time, but how you measure time, and then maybe what it does for another phenomena that I think we need to capture, which is the present. It can
hmm,
screw up the present. That's
yeah,
where the implication comes in. Yeah, but the ubiquity of time, though, it still seems like wherever you go, there's going to be time. It's just maybe things get a little bit screwy, but there's still time there because there's
yeah.
before and after relations. You can establish before and after relations and
Cool,
simultaneous relations to some extent. Yeah.
awesome.
So you want to capture a different phenomena like the ubiquity of time. You want to explain how is change possible? Because change does seem like it's closely connected to time. Because remember when we were defining change earlier, it was things being in incompatible ways at different
Yeah,
moments. So it seems like, okay, well, time is going to be wrapped up in explaining change. Other things you want to try to capture is like, why does anything exist at the present? Like, what
hmm,
establishes this before and after relations, and what establishes the stuff that, like, why does this stuff exist in the present? And so when you look at the history of ideas in Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy, this is the temporal landscape that they're trying to capture. And they're trying to say, we need a theory that explains all of this, the ubiquity of time and things that explain how there's these different moments, why they're ordered the way that they are, why do things exist at the present, uh, how can you bring about change and why are causes always before their effects? And
yeah,
so the answer they give is time. It's this actual substance
yeah,
in the world. So when we're doing our ontological inventory, you go, time, it's right there.
yep,
It's on my list. And it's supposed to explain all this phenomena. If you don't like it, because some people think that's just too much stuff to introduce into our ontology, then you have to go to the relational theory.
hmm,
But then you get all the problems that the
yeah,
relational theory has.
yeah. And that doesn't really bother it. I don't think it should. The people that care about simplicity that much, I think, It's just your methodology is a little screwy then.
Yeah, because if your theory of like, here's all my theoretical virtues, and I'm gonna like have all this simplicity in there. I'm with the simplest theory. You're like, but you sacrificed explanatory power and
Yeah.
like accuracy and like all this other stuff. Like,
Yeah.
what's going on here? Yeah,
Or
yeah.
coherence in general.
Coherence, you know, these
I
these are
think that one's
details.
really important.
It does. It feels like it's important. So yeah, I really like Swinburne's line on this, where he's like, simplicity is like like usually kind of comes at the end of when
Yeah,
we're weighing
it's a
different
tiebreaker.
theories. Yeah, hopefully, you know,
Mm.
because sometimes like it's hard to figure out how these things are like, or how to really measure them. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's the idea.
Cool. So now I'm wondering, because I've heard, because if we're at this conclusion that time is a substance,
Mhm.
some questions now are going to be like, well, what does that even mean?
Right.
Like, right? Because I've heard some people just say time is a substance that's independent of God,
Mhm.
for instance, which for me, that's okay. It doesn't bother me. Some people who want to maintain like absolute aseity might want to ground time in God's nature or something like that. So what are the options on the table, I guess, for the Christian here?
Yeah. So the historical options, like uh, Emily Thomas has a really great book on this called Absolute Time: Rifts in Modern British Thought, and she's looking at the scientific revolution, and she goes through like the three most popular versions of this. So one option is to say there's God, and then God creates the substance that is time. Like that's one view you could affirm. I forget what she calls that view. I think that might be the Pierre Gassendi view. Because there's some interpretations of Gassendi where it looks like that's what he's saying. Another view, she calls it the Newtonian view, but then she points out it's not actually Newton's view at all, but it's just what a lot of later Newtonians affirmed, which is you've got God and absolute time, and you don't even attempt to really describe what the relationship is between the two. You just don't even really think about it or reflect on it. So it
Okay.
might be that there's just these two completely independent substances that are there.
Okay.
And you actually do see that in the Nyaya Vaisheshika school of Indian philosophy. There are some people who do affirm there's God and there's a bunch of these other substances that are just there. They're all co-eternal. They don't cause each other to exist. They're all just there. They're all ase. They're all equally, well, there's no such thing as equally ase. You're just ase or you're not.
Yeah.
So they're all ase. And then there's the view she calls the Moreian view, named after Henry More. And this is the view that Henry More and Isaac Newton and Samuel Clarke affirm, where God is that substance that we call time. And then they'll usually kind of try to nuance the view a bit to say it's more like a mode of God or an attribute of God. But the idea is like I can attribute time to God because God is that substance that is ubiquitous, that explains all the temporal phenomena, the temporal landscape that we're trying to capture.
Yeah. Awesome. I haven't read that book, so I just found it, and it's very expensive, but
it's expensive. Maybe try to get it from a library or find a journal that you could do a review of it for free. But it's good. Like she really knows her stuff. She's currently working on a history of philosophy of time. I'm really excited to see because one of the things she's gonna be arguing is that presentism, like no one questioned it at all until you get to around Einstein. Like people just weren't even interested in those questions in the Western world.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yes, I've thought this for a long time, but someone who's like really, really good historian doing that, I'm like, yes, please, Emily, please do this. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so we've gotten to this like absolute theory of time. We have the options on the table with regards to ontology. Now it's the question of like, well, what because there's two theory of time debates, right? There's that absolute versus relational. Now it's like broadly speaking, you have B theory of time, A theory of time, or like a growing block theory of time. Am I missing anything?
So the A theory, B theory debate is related to another question, which is the ontology of time, which is like which moments of time exist. And that's where you get like presentism, growing block, eternalism, and a bunch of this stuff. So the A theory, B theory, well, let's talk about that first, because that's going to be really important when we start talking about providence and foreknowledge and all that.
Yeah.
And I've got this bizarre argument that I've not seen anyone do where all the theories of providence entail the A theory. I've not seen anyone argue this before. So
nice. Yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah. So when you're looking at the A theory or B theory, or what's sometimes called the tenseless or tensed theory of times, you're trying to figure out if which is the fundamental story of reality. You want to
Mhm.
describe all the temporal reality. What's the best way to capture that? Well, there's different kinds of temporal propositions. So a tensed proposition is a proposition that talks about the world in terms of past, present, and future. So Ryan and Than are talking right now. That's a
Mhm.
tensed proposition. Ryan and Than will talk. Ryan and Than were talking. So these are all tense propositions.
Mhm.
And if you think that if you believe that the tense theory is true, what you're saying is you cannot give a full description of temporal reality without these tensed propositions. You can't really give a whole description of the world without these tense propositions, without talking about past, present, and future.
Mhm.
So there's something important about the present that entails that there's a difference between the past, present, and future.
Yeah.
What that specialness is, that's another story, but
Yeah.
that's the idea. The tenseless theory says, no. I can give you the full story of the world without referring to anything about the past, present, or future. So I've got different temporal propositions. What I have are tenseless propositions, and they're temporal propositions because they're propositions about time. But what they do is they specify that they'll say that they'll talk about things in terms of their specific dates. So Ryan and Than are talking at August 24th, 8 p.m. Eastern
Yeah.
Standard Time. Ryan and they'll also talk in terms of earlier than and later than relations. So the Battle of Waterloo was earlier than the event of Ryan and Than talking.
Mhm.
So they'll try to describe reality only in terms of these, without making any reference to the past, present, or future. That's what the tenseless theory is trying to
Yeah.
do.
Like maybe I'm trying to think of a way to popularize it more. Just would you say it's fair to say like chronological plate, not even chronological, that's temporal language.
Well,
Um
it's still
well,
a theory of time. So
yeah. Yeah, I guess yeah, so just chronological placement would be a good way of saying that. Like if you have a measuring stick is typically the analogy I give,
mhm,
and here's X moment of time and here's Y moment of time. Somewhere in here we're describing an event, but it's not like a was, is, or will kind of a thing.
correct. It's just
Yeah.
it's earlier than
Yeah.
relative to where that other event you're
Yeah.
describing, but that's it. Yeah, and it's so you still have a world with earlier than and later than relationships, simultaneous relationships. There's still succession and change in the world, but there's just no such thing as past, present, or future. Yeah, and there's no facts about what's happening right now. And
Mhm.
that's where things get really radical because so you'll have these arguments against the view that'll go something like this. Basically, they'll just try to set up some sort of like event that's coming, like you've got an
Yeah.
exam coming up soon, or a dentist appointment you're really worried about,
Mhm.
and it's like, okay, well, can you describe you going to the event, going to like your meeting or your dentist appointment or your exam? Can you describe that without any tensed propositions? So say you're anxious about the dentist appointment. You're like,
Mhm.
it's like, oh gosh, it's going to hurt, so you're scared. Well, how do you really capture that without talking about in terms of that event is going to happen? It's forthcoming. You could say like, well, so here's one of the questions people, Arthur Pryor has this really famous thought experiment where he goes like this, where he says like, I want to be able to say, thank goodness that's over. Like
Yeah.
after, I have this awful dentist appointment. Thank goodness that's over. What am I talking about there though? Because I could say, well, yeah, thank goodness that's over at Monday at 7 p.m. at such and such. Is that what I'm really like? Thank goodness that's over for.
Yeah.
Well, no, because today's Thursday. Like
Yeah.
yeah, and so he says like your placement in relation to that event really matters for like which emotions you're going to have, and you can't capture that without describing things in terms of past, present, and future,
Mhm.
because you're not like grateful that the dentist appointment ends at on Monday at 2 p.m. Uh, because you're grateful that it's now over, like it's all
Yeah.
now over and done with.
Yeah. No, I like that. So, we don't have to get into this now if you don't want to or if we don't have time, but generally somebody at this point might just kind of point to physics as a
Mhm.
defeater for this kind of thing. So do you want to talk about that at all or
Yeah, this it's worth talking about. So there's this thing called stuff that happened after the 1920s. and and a lot of pop physics doesn't do that. It typically goes like, sorry, I'm living in Philly, so people drive by very loudly.
Yep.
Yeah. This is just the summer still. Yeah. Anyway, I hate the city.
That's why you got to move into the boonies. I
Yeah.
made the best decision of my life.
I'm tempted sometimes. So yeah. So when Einstein first came up with the special theory of relativity, he thought something like the A theory was true. Like he really did. And it took him, I think it was about 10 years to be convinced that Minkowski's space-time geometry was the correct way to describe reality, to the correct way to develop the special theory. Because apparently, I guess like Einstein was famous for being really bad at math, so he just didn't quite like understand how like the maths was supposed to work out. And eventually, he's like, okay, sure, I guess Minkowski, you're right, fine. Now, when you have that space-time geometry, that Minkowski space-time geometry, it's very difficult to pinpoint the present. And so people will try to use this as a way of saying, well, we should stop talking about things in terms of past, present, or future. Instead, we should talk in terms of just tenseless propositions.
Yeah.
Now, remember, though, I said there's this thing called physics after the 1920s. So fast forward to 2004, or is it 2005? It's one of those years. The Nobel Prize in physics goes to this guy named David Gross. And he gets a Nobel Prize in physics for declaring that space-time is dead. Like, and that's like, because he's like, because here's the basic premise is we all know that this is false. Like this theory gives us useful predictions. It really does. But we know that the space-time geometry just isn't working. It's not really giving us all the useful predictions we want. It's predicted, and we can't reconcile it with, it doesn't even account for gravity. That's why we need the general theory, and we can't reconcile these things with quantum mechanics. So we need a new, entirely new geometry to figure this out.
Yep.
And so that's kicked off this entire project in contemporary physics of under the banner of space-time is doomed, and which is really metal. So it's it's pretty cool. But that's a working assumption for all these people. Like, so I was at the Higgs Center for Theoretical Physics a few years ago, and there's this theoretical physicist named Nima Arkani Ahmed, and his talk was also called "Space-Time is Doomed," and he just starts off like first thing out of his mouth is like, "Well, we all know that like this theory is false," and I'm like, excuse me. And I look around the room, just, like hundreds of physicists, and they're like, yes, of course, carry on. And he's like, well, what we need to come up with something to replace that theory with. I was like, okay, cool. And so then he goes over for like the next like hour and a half, he goes through all the geometry of what he wants to replace it with. And then he ends it in a way that annoyed my wife and I so much. And he goes, but of course, this is also false. This is also just a fiction. The geometry I've come up with is also just a fiction, but it gives us better predictions. And I was like, okay, so we're still doing this thing.
We're doing this
this useful fiction stuff. Yeah. And this is a thing in physics is of a useful fictions. They're theories that we know they're not quite right, but they get the job done in terms of what the results we want. So we don't care. Yeah. You don't see that in a lot of other scientific disciplines, but it's quite big in physics. So like biology, they don't like molecular biology. They just think that's the stupidest thing in the world. They're like, they're like, why would you do that? I mean, tell that to the philosopher, and people we're gonna be like, So basically, this is the way Jeff Kapersky explains it. So Jeff Kapersky is a philosopher of physics, and he describes, he's like, look, we've got all these different theories. We've got theories from special theory. We've got we've got the general theory. We've got all the different interpretations of quantum mechanics. We know they don't fit together at all. We know that. It's this broken tapestry, and trying to figure out how to fit it all together, we have no idea. You have to be an anti-realist or an instrumentalist about something somewhere in this whole patchwork of physics. And for me, I want to go, well, since all these physicists are actively trying to replace the space-time geometry of the special theory, then why should I even bother with worrying about making my metaphysics fit with what the special theory is saying? Bradley Motton also has a really good paper on this. It's called like the future of all physics-based metaphysics, where he just says taking the really obvious fact that the present moment exists. Why would you want to put all your money on this theory that we know is false and just change your metaphysics around? These are all controversial things I'm saying right now, but
it's it's controversial, but I'm trying to like pick the right words here because the reason I really wanted to go into that one, this particular
Mhm,
topic, is because maybe not. It's not so much. Well, actually, I do think it's kind of prevalent in the academic literature still,
mhm.
because people take for granted this instrumentalist or anti-realist like view that a lot of physicists take. But especially on a popular level, there's just this. I don't know where it's coming from. Well, there's the disconnect, obviously in the academic world, but on the pop level world, people just for some reason still think special relativity like is
Yeah.
king, and I'm just like,
Yeah. It's wild to me. I mean, I understand it because I mean, the way the 20th century developed, like especially to the latter half of the 20th century, we needed a new religion. We needed new gods among men. And the scientists were like, the physicists were it. I mean,
yeah,
they ushered in this nuclear era that we're living in. I mean,
yeah,
they changed everything. And and it really was kind of a golden age of physics, even though a lot of those physicists, I mean, according to Tim Maudlin, he's a philosopher of physics, when he tells the story, he's like, yeah, everybody doing quantum mechanics in those days, they were all instrumentalists because they all thought, this stuff is what we're saying is crazy. But for some reason, like everybody's like, yeah, let's take them realistically and let's like
yeah,
create all this new age stuff around it. And I'm like, what a
yeah.
bizarre world. So it's one of these things where you've got these nuanced philosophical issues that do not get talked about by the physicists because most of them don't have training in philosophy and because they're
Hmm.
not interested in that stuff, which is fine. They've got enough on their plate. And then you've got all these other philosophers though who don't have the requisite training in physics to really understand what's being taken realistically and what's being taken in just an instrumentalist way.
Yeah,
And so it just creates like a hodgepodge, like this absolute mess. And then when you've got someone like Stephen Hawking, who's just like this complete rock star, come along and write a really good popular level book, you don't want to go against that.
hmm,
Or when Carlo Rovelli writes a really like good popular level book, you don't want to go against that. Otherwise you're being an idiot. You're being
yeah.
anti-scientific, which is
Fair
fine.
enough.
I'm not a scientist, so I hate science. It's all. I'm not against it all. No. I'm married to a biologist, so I can't say
Fair
that.
enough. Real quick here, a friend of mine from a channel called Idol Killer. If you know who it is, he
Yes,
says, "My
yeah.
mom is a huge fan of Ryan. True story. Can you say hi to Cindy?"
Oh yeah. Hey Cindy, how you doing?
Awesome.
Yeah.
She'll love that.
Yeah, no, I've been on Idol Killer a few times. I've got a shirt that he gave me. It's got like this. It's like got like a
Oh,
John Calvin on it and everything. It's really cool.
nice, nice. I'm actually I'll let everybody I'll break it here. I'm working on merch.
There you go.
If you guys know who Meme Lord Monday is, or another meme page called Memes for Jesus, the guy from that runs those pages is going to help me kind of do some more stuff on that end. So I'll send you a shirt, Ryan.
Nice. All right. Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Cool. All right. So I'm glad we talked about that because it's just something people take for granted, and I
Mhm.
think it's just something that people listening to us will just be like, well, what about the physics? And I also, maybe this is controversial,
Mhm.
but that's okay. Everything is. Um, I'm also one of those people that I just think that like philosophy is more fundamental to physics, and I just think like no amount of physics is going to overturn a philosophical issue, if that makes sense.
I
Um,
think so. That I mean, there's different views on this though. So when you look at David Bohm, who was one of these big guys in the early days of quantum mechanics, he got laughed out of the field actually because he wanted to be a realist about all this stuff, and everyone's like, I'm sorry, but that's crazy. Like
yeah,
you can't, which is wild to me because they just see again like all the anti-realism in there. They push out someone who's wanting to actually be a realist.
yeah,
But Bohm actually had a really interesting philosophical mind, and he found a bunch of process philosophers at the time who were willing to dialogue with him. And so I just examined a PhD dissertation on this last year by Samsa Korpela in Helsinki. And so he just lays out David Bohm's physics and then how it relates to questions about God and time and foreknowledge and stuff. And what David Bohm was trying to do was go, we have to have a physics that fits the world. And one of the things that we find in the world is there's the present moment, and there's change and there's the sequence. Like you can't get rid of that. That's
yeah.
stupid. And so he starts developing a realist interpretation of quantum mechanics, where the present moment of time just comes back really obviously. It's there. Free will. He really wants to make sure that you've got a future where you, in a way that you can actually have free will and all this stuff. So all
Hmm.
these things come right back when you put in the philosophical work to figure out which theories are the best
Yeah.
ones. Yeah, I think you're right. Like, there's a bunch of cases where it might be that physics can't overturn certain philosophical views.
Yeah.
And I think this is one of them.
Yeah, I'm open to the fact that maybe especially because I think in a very Bayesian way. So it's just like it could very well be the case that a certain amount of physics might make me rethink, make like, let's just say I find a contradiction in some
Mhm.
issue, and physics tells this, and I'm just like, well, maybe there's an answer to this contradiction outside of my epistemic purview, kind of a thing.
Mhm.
So I'm open to that. I was just trying to make like a principle claim there, whatever you want to say.
Yeah.
So okay, so we've talked about absolute versus relational theory of time. We've talked about a theory of time at this point, some of the physics that surrounds it. Do you want to talk about like the growing block theory of time and what that might be?
Let me say one more thing about the tense versus
Yeah, okay.
tenseless, and then we get into the ontology stuff, because I need this one other piece that'll be
Yeah.
important for providence and all that, and foreknowledge. So the tensed theory of time that talks about past, present, and future, it will say that the temporal propositions, can change their truth value as reality undergoes a bunch of changes.
Mm-hmm.
Because the proposition Ryan and Than will talk tonight, like, that was true earlier, but now it's false because we are talking.
Mm-hmm.
And so some propositions about what will happen, what is happening, those things can change their truth value
Mm-hmm.
as reality progresses forward, as the sum total facts of reality change. Whereas on the tenseless theory, the propositions do not change their truth value. They cannot change their truth value. Ryan and Than talk at 8 p.m. on such and such date. Like, that's just true, or it's false.
Yeah.
That's it. They don't change their truth value. That's going to be important for when we talk about the different
Yeah,
theories
yeah.
of providence. Now, so what you're asking earlier, though, so a lot of people thought that the A theory, B theory, or tensed and tenseless debate somehow entails something for the question, what moments of time exist? And it might, but one of the things that's kind of developed over the last 20 years in the philosophy of time is that no one can agree on what those entailments should be, like we thought they were. So it's a complete mess. So I usually don't bring them together because I've just been beaten over the head by too many people going, actually, and I'm like,
Actually.
yeah. So it's just like, oh my God. But here's the question is, what moments of time exist?
Yeah.
The standard view throughout most of history is presentism. The present is it. The present exhausts reality.
Yeah.
There's other views, though. You could say there's past and present, and this was the growing block. So as reality continues to change and progress, new moments of time are getting added to the block, and so the block keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. That's why it's growing. And then there's what's called eternalism, which says, in loosely, past, present, and future equally exist.
Yeah.
Technically, though, usually they usually will go with the B theory or the tenseless theory, and will say there's no such thing as the past, present, and future.
I have a hard time making sense of eternalism on an A theory of time.
Yeah, it's weird. Here's what you do. There's a couple moves you can make. One is you can treat the entire block of time as the present. Like, so I saw this. I attended a talk once by this philosopher named Kian Dor, who that's what he did, and your reaction right there was what everyone in the room did, and they're like, "Now you don't really mean that, right? You mean something else." And he's like, "No, the whole thing's present, so it's an A theory." And they were like, ah. And so I remember, like, Catherine Holly, like she was in the room, and she just kept, like, she does this thing where she would be playing with her hair when she'd be thinking, and she just went, ah. You don't actually mean that, right? And she's like, and he's like, no, yeah, I really mean the A theory. She's like,
I was like actually just thinking about it. I'm like, I'm just in my head, I'm just trying to make sense of it. Like,
yeah. And that was the entire Q&A was people just continually going, you don't really mean that, right? And he's like, yes, I do. It was wild. It was great. Yeah.
I'm self-conscious of my my philosophical pondering look, because people in the past have been making fun of me because when I'm thinking, typically what I do in the past is stare at the tile of the ceiling, and now people made fun of me for that. Now, so it's funny.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, I can't make sense of that, but okay. Um,
That's like one
Interesting.
move. There's some
Yeah.
others you do where you have to develop like the temporal logic in all these different ways. So Ulrich Mayer, he's a really good philosopher. He has this nice book called The Nature of Time. Insanely technical temporal logic. So if you don't know some basic logic, then don't read it because you're not going to get it. Like it took me months to work through it because I was like, it's been forever since I took logic. Gosh, what does this symbol mean again? But he's an eternalist, but he develops a tensed theory of time. Like he thinks that A.N. Pryor's tensed theory of time is the right way to go. It captures everything. And so Mayer lays out in all the nice detail, this is exactly how you should do it.
Okay.
How it all fits together, I'm like, but I don't know.
Yeah. I don't want to just outright say it's false just because I can't compute it. But
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so we got that option on the table then.
Mhm.
What else do we got this then? Because we then at that point we're a tensed A theory or tensed growing block, right?
Yeah, and you also have these people they'll be presentists who will affirm the tenseless theory because they think it's a good way to ground propositions about the past, present, and future in tenseless propositions. There's this whole, it's super technical, it's super nerdy, and I just don't think it works. And so I'm just like, just be just affirm the A theory,
Yeah.
just affirm the tense theory, just stop it. But yeah, I'm just letting people know that like these are options. These are
Yeah.
quite popular moves that people do.
Were you interested in talking about like truth makers, like truth making theories here?
Mhm.
Because I think you said something like, okay, so on the A theory of time, or like on presentism, um, you said some of these facts like will change their truth value.
Mhm.
So, for instance, like the proposition, right? No, okay, let's just say the proposition Dan and Ryan will talk at 7 Central was true prior to 7 Central, right? Um, but what's like the referent that makes it false, if that makes sense, what I'm asking
Mhm.
there, if presentism is true instead of growing block.
Right. Because so if you've got like, so let's back up a second. So we just talk
Yeah.
about what truth makers are. So
Yeah.
we've got
Sorry.
these different propositions. Yeah. So we've got these different propositions about what was the case, what is the case, what will be the case. And the truth maker theory starts with a really intuitive principle, which is truth supervenes on being. What that means is there has to be something, some item in the world, something on my ontological inventory that I can
Yeah.
point to that makes that proposition true.
Yeah. The way I typically here's my popularization of that I typically go with it when that's something along the lines of just like if I utter the proposition, there's a hand on the screen, right? It's true
Mhm.
in virtue of the fact that it's like referring to an actual state of affairs that properly like is described by that proposition.
Right.
That's like my way of popularizing that. Is that fair?
Yeah. Yeah. Because what
Okay.
you're doing is you're saying there's this thing that exists on my list, my ontological inventory, my
Yeah.
hand. It's right
Yeah.
there. And that's what's making this thing
Yeah.
true. Yeah. So that's what the truth maker theory does. And so the truth making project is to try to find all the things in reality that are on your ontological inventory that you can go, that's what makes this proposition true. That's what makes this proposition true.
Hmm.
If you affirm presentism, that only the present moment exists, well, we've got all these propositions about the past, what happened in the past, and what's going to happen in the future, and you got to go, well, but the future, those moments don't exist, and the past
Yeah.
moments no longer exist. What's the thing you can point towards? And you're like, oh goodness, this crap. And so
This is gonna open up the can of worms now.
yeah, yeah. I mean, the short answer is truth maker theory is false, so who cares? But no, this is just a slightly longer version of it because that's me being like really flippant, which is what you expect, but still.
Yeah, no, I love it. That's why you're one of my favorite philosophers.
So if people are interested, Trenton Merrick's has a book called Truth and Ontology, and then Jonathan Talent has a book called Truth in the World. And so what I'm doing is a super fast and dirty version of what they did, and then also I'll mention some other people along the way. So let's focus on the truths about the past for a second. That one's easier to deal with, I think. So what makes it true that Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States of America? Because you're like, well, he's dead, he's gone. Like, what's going on here? I need
That
something
moment
that
in time
exists.
doesn't exist.
Right. So I'm like, gosh, what's the thing I can point towards? One option is you find something that exists in the present that you can point towards that would ground the truths about that past.
Hmm.
So you're like, well, if Abraham Lincoln was still around, or maybe his body is still around, or his bones or something, we could be like, well, there we go. That's the thing right there that has that's the property bearer of 16th president. And depending on your beliefs about life after death, a very standard Christian claim is this doctrine of the intermediate state, that absent from the body, present with the Lord. So when you die, your soul goes to be, you are the soul, you go to be with God. Or if you're not a great person, you might go somewhere else. It depends.
You'll be annihilated on my account. But
Okay, so this is, oh gosh, okay. Well, so if you annihilate them, like, so I was gonna say, I was like, so say Abraham Lincoln like goes to heaven, and he's waiting a resurrection. Well, there we go. He exists. The soul exists, and he's the bearer of these propositions about being the 16th president. If he gets annihilated, though, oh gosh, crap, what do we do now? Like that guy's gone. What's gonna ground that truth? One option is to go, well, God's memory. Like, God was the being who sustained all this stuff in existence. So he's always been there. And so it's true that God once sustained Abraham Lincoln in existence. And so God serves as the truth maker. And then his memories are things that he presently has. So those are going to ground all the truths. So this is one way you could go. That's assuming you want to continue to affirm truth maker theory. If you want to get rid of truth maker theory, here's one way you could do it. So this is from John Leslie, who's an eternalist, and then Patrick Todd, who's an open theist. They both run similar arguments like this. They'll say, imagine that the universe is just going along, and then everything, absolutely everything, just ceases to exist. Well, surely it would still be true that the universe existed. Like, just because the universe ceases to exist, you'd be like, well, there's no thing there that makes it be like, well, what a bizarre world that is. How is it the case that, like, if things get annihilated from the past, then that somehow undermines truth?
Yeah.
That just seems silly. And so what John Leslie and Patrick Todd, and then like the other people I mentioned, like Merrick's and Talent, well, they'll point a bunch of examples like this just to go like, look, you don't really need these truth makers, because once something's true, it's true, full stop. It just seems like that's the prerogative of truth, is just that once something's true, that's it. It's explained by the way the world was, but you don't need a thing that still exists to make it true, because once something's true, it's just true. That's it. And then you can point to these other cases like 2 + 2 = 4. What makes that true? Well, it just is true.
The Platonist might say it's some abstract. The divine conceptualist might say it's the mind of God.
The mind of God, but at some point you're just going to get to something that is just true, full stop. And necessary, when you get to like necessity, that's a pretty natural stopping point. Where you're like, what's making these things? And so what a lot of truth maker theorists will do is, when they're looking at these natural stopping points, they'll just go, well, maybe truth maker theory doesn't apply to that. Maybe it doesn't apply. And then they start like really paring down. And so Jonathan Talent will go, hang on a second. You told me that this was like this grand truth making project where you're going to explain all of reality with this thing. And now you're like just kind of narrowing it down over and over again to where it's like, what's it doing anymore?
Yeah. That's kind of the trajectory I took. By the way, I got to this necessity and I was just like, well, I guess it just doesn't apply there. And then I was like, okay, well, what am I actually doing?
Yeah. And then I had the same experience. And so when I discovered Trenton Merrick's book during my master's, it was like, this guy's onto something, but everybody hated it. And then Jonathan Talent's book came out, I think it was 2020, and I was reading it. I was like, okay, there we go. This is it.
Yeah.
Like, I'm just done with truth maker. So yeah.
Fair enough. Cool. Okay. So, given everything we've talked about so far, how much time do you have left?
No, I just, until my cat just goes completely nuts. That's it.
Cool.
Which is, who knows? I mean, it's a ticking time bomb.
In 30 seconds.
Yeah.
So given everything we've talked about, how does this affect how we view God with regards to providence, his knowledge of the future, all this stuff? Like,
yes.
I don't know where you want to start there either.
Well, I I've got this with my little book about a big God that I'm doing the copy editing on it right now. It's painfully annoying. So hopefully it'll get printed like right after, as soon as I'm done with that, because I'm tired of it. I've got this interesting argument that I've not seen anywhere else, which says all the big theories of providence, you have to affirm a tensed theory of time, which is going to be shocking because a lot of people want to, like a lot of Calvinists, for instance, and like all the different classical theists and Thomists today, not historically, but today, want to affirm a tenseless theory. And I want to go, that's just inconsistent. So here's why. So when you look at Calvinism, Molinism, and open theism, they agree on something that's really shocking that nobody wants to talk about too much. So there's this distinction between natural knowledge and free knowledge. And then the Molinist wants to sneak in something in between those two things called middle knowledge. We can get to that in a second, but it doesn't matter as much for the argument. At the state of natural knowledge, what does God know? He knows his own nature, his own essence. That's why it's called natural knowledge. And he know, and from this, he's able to intuit all of the logical possibilities.
Yep.
He knows all the ways the world could be. Just could. That's it. Not the way the world will be. And when you look at different Calvinists historically, some today are more open about this too. So like Terence Thiessen is really open about this. John Feinberg's very open about this. And then all the dead guys will go, right, at that moment of natural knowledge, God does not have foreknowledge because there is no fact of the matter about what God will do. Is God going to create a universe, or is he just going to go, no, I don't want to? It is completely indeterminate. There is no fact of the matter about what God's going to do. So there's nothing there to know.
Yeah.
And the open theist is going to go, that's what I've been saying all along, guys. Like,
yeah.
Does it?
So, but at this point, you could say something like God might know his intentions.
Might, but we're not talking about will.
Yeah.
And that's important. Because what you have very clearly, and again, like when you look throughout the history of Calvinism on this, like at that natural knowledge, he does not have it. Well, what they're all super clear on is it's once God decides that he will create, then he knows that he's going to create. But what will he create? Well, we're not there yet. You know, he has to make that decision too. Once God decides this is the universe that I will freely create, this is the exact timeline that I will freely create, then God gets something called free knowledge, which is knowledge of what he's freely decided to do. Yeah. And that is the foundation of God's foreknowledge. And so you see this in, like Francis Turretin, William Shedd, and a lot of different Calvinist thinkers are going like, right, the foundation of God's foreknowledge is free knowledge. So because once God decides this is how the future is going to go, well, then you get a bunch of facts about how the future is going to go. Here's where this relates to the tense versus tenseless. So remember, the tensed theory says that propositions about what will be the case, they can change their truth value. Whereas the tenseless theory says all the temporal propositions do not and cannot change their truth value. Well, that transition from God's natural knowledge to free knowledge, you've got propositions changing the truth value. So what God will do, you could either say it's just completely indeterminate, or all the propositions are false about what God will do. And then until God decides what he's going to do, and then one of them switches over to true. Yeah. But you've got truth switching. The truth values are switching. And that's only possible on the tensed theory. So the tenseless theory doesn't allow that at all. So the tenseless theory just doesn't fit with Calvinism. And then the Molinist says the exact same thing. So it doesn't fit with Molinism. And the open theist doesn't want the tenseless theory. So it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Okay. So quick question. What about the Calvinist? Because it seems to me like the Molinist doesn't really affect them that much on this question. So this is more just for the Calvinist. What if they hold to like an eternalist notion of the universe, where like they don't actually believe in ex nihilo, and I don't know where I'm going with this. This is just a thought that just literally just popped up in my head, but maybe you can see where I'm going with this
a little bit,
where it's like, if the universe is eternal, God isn't actually instantiating a timeline or like a specific type of universe. He just foreknows what will happen in the universe, and determines certain things to happen or something like that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, it doesn't work, and here's why. So there's what's called the simple foreknowledge view, which is God knows what happens in the future because he's just seeing it happen. Like that's just
Hmm.
because you've got this eternal block there.
Yeah, yeah.
So William Hasker has a series of arguments that I find very persuasive. That the argument just goes, simple foreknowledge is providentially useless, and then he's got a later paper called simple foreknowledge is still useless. And then Aldo Frigero and Shiro De Florio have a really great paper on it too. I can't remember the exact title because it's in Italian, but it's
I really
basically.
want to hear you say the title in Italian now.
I wish I don't have it right in front of me, but it's like I mean it's foreknowledge it's simple is just simple, then the foreknowledge is for a knowledge is wait that is wisdom. Oh gosh. Good thing my wife's not watching this. Yeah, yeah, it's a good thing my wife's not watching this. She's like, you haven't been practicing your Italian. I'm like,
Yeah. Is your wife Italian?
yeah.
Oh man. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, one day if we ever get in meet each other in person, maybe for that conference, we'll do a little Italian versus Greek cook-off.
There we go. Yeah, she can make. Oh, she's good. She's very good. But yeah, so a lot of people keep pushing this argument, and so basically, here's the idea: is so you've got God in the eternal block, and He's looking to see what happens.
Hmm.
Well, where do you get the providential control now? Because what's happening is just what's happening. It's too late
Yeah.
to do anything about it. And so all of the providential actions that God could perform, well, it's too late. That's just what's happening.
Oh, okay. One of the things I took for granted in there is everything that's going to happen is going to happen, and for some reason in my head, I actually like excluded God from that almost.
Mhm.
So that makes sense. Okay.
And this is why the Calvinists, when they're talking about creation ex nihilo, one of the things they really emphasize so much is creation ex nihilo says prior to creation, God exists all alone. And so
Mhm.
you'll see all these statements. So Arthur W. Pink is a Calvinist. He's got all these grand statements about in that state of affairs where God's all alone, God has this maximal freedom. It's the most glorious state ever, because like nothing can influence like why he decrees one way or the other because he's all alone.
Yeah.
And so you really do get God's got all the options because nothing could push him or pull him or influence him to go one way or the other because there's nothing else that exists.
Mhm.
Whereas if you've got the universe being co-eternal with God, it's really hard to figure out how you get providence because when could God decide what he wants to take place?
Mhm.
Because he's just eternally there with all this eternal stuff.
Yeah.
There's no when God gets to go, I want that instead of that.
Yeah. Fair enough. Okay. Sorry to detract us. There was just
No.
a random question that came up. Okay,
Yeah.
so now, yeah. So I mean, sorry, Calvinists and people from Reformed camps, but to me, it just seems like the two best options on the table are going to be some sort of open theist position or a Molinist position here. So the open theist. Well, let's pause there for a second, actually. Because I am actually forgot what we said before I asked that question.
Mhm.
So where were we again?
So all I've done is pointed out that there's the dirty little secret that people don't like to talk about, which is at that moment of natural knowledge, God does not know the future because there just are no truths about what will take place, including no truths about what God will do. And the Calvinists and the Molinists are very, very explicit on this. Molina actually has a whole section where he describes why God would not have free will if there were truths about what God would do before he
Mhm.
decides what he's going to do. He doesn't
Gotcha.
apply that to humans. It's only a problem for God. But apparently, it's not a problem for us to have truths about our future fully determined before we decide. But
Yeah,
anyway,
fair enough.
but yeah, all that to say, at that moment of natural knowledge, it's just God doesn't know the future because there's nothing to know, and that
Gotcha.
requires that propositions about the future they change their truth value.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so you can't have
So
a tenseless theory; you have to have a tense theory.
so is it fair to say that sans creation, even the Calvinist is going to be committed to a moment at least where like open theism is true?
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, getting a Calvinist to admit it,
Yeah.
I mean, right. John Feinberg in his systematic theology is No One Like Him, his Doctrine of God book. He's very explicit about this
Hmm.
because he affirms that God's temporal, whereas when a lot of other Calvinists who want to affirm that God's timeless, when they start looking at this, they try to fudge it and go, well, these are just logical moments. They're not temporal moments. So God somehow eternally knows everything, but yet at this logical moment, he doesn't know anything. So what you get is a contradiction, I think, because what you have is from all eternity, God doesn't know what he's going to do. And from all eternity, God does know what he's going to do.
Yeah.
Because those logical moments are both embedded in God's single timeless moment.
Yeah. That's another one of those, like, I just can't make sense of it. Okay.
Yeah. I don't think you can make sense of it. And when people get challenged on it, there's a weird history here where when different Calvinists get challenged on this stuff, sometimes they'll just go, well, this is just a useful fiction in order to tell my dogmatics. And that you can get released of all these awful heresy charges against you if you make that statement. Whereas some others will go, no, this has got to be realistic. So there's a debate amongst Calvinists themselves about whether or not they want to be realists or anti-realists about these logical moments.
Interesting. Okay, so what does this mean for providence, or like where do you want to go from there?
So what it goes for providence, one of the things I want to do in this little book and some of the stuff I've been doing on just trying to figure out my own theories of providence is I want to try to create an equal playing field for assessing the different theories, because what you get is these kind of arguments against open theism. Well, God doesn't know the future, therefore he's not omniscient. And I'm like, well, the Calvinist theory and the Molinist theory explicitly have the moment of natural knowledge where God does not and cannot possibly know the future. Mm-hmm. So if it's a problem that God's not omniscient on open theism, then it's going to be a problem for everybody else.
Yeah.
And so let's just get rid of that stupid objection. Because there's nothing there to know. So God can't be, he's not omniscient because he doesn't know the stuff that there's nothing to know about. That's just dumb. So let's just get rid of dumb objections, because if you really want to go with a dumb objection, it's going to apply to everyone in this case. Yeah.
I like that. Usually when people play that card with me, what I just say is like, well, do I have less knowledge because I don't know about my seventh son? Right. Well, no, I don't. I promise for my wife, if you're watching, I don't have other children. But so it's the same kind of question, though, right? It's like, well, I don't have a seventh son, so it's like, well, of course I don't have knowledge of that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, cool. And so that's part of it, is to just level the playing field and go, okay, let's get down to brass tacks. Where I think it comes down to is something we started to talk a little bit about off air. So you'll see a lot of open theists, William Hasker, Richard Rice, a lot of these people, they'll do this kind of move. They'll say, God can create a Calvinist universe if he wants, or he could create a Molinist universe if he wants, or he could create an open universe if he wants. Mm-hmm. These are all options God has. So now we get into this debate about which kind of universe did God create? Did he create a Calvinist universe, a Molinist universe, an open universe? And that's where I think the arguments should be, and it's where they start to get really interesting, because then I think you can start assessing these views in different ways, instead of just like these kind of tired arguments about, oh, my God's more omniscient, my God could beat up your God kind of stuff, and just be like, let's grow up a bit.
Yeah. My dad can beat up your dad.
Yeah, exactly.
I actually have my counter to that, by the way, is especially if you read like a lot of Jewish mysticism, like the Kabbalah, like
the Kabbalists,
yeah, like they're actually gonna, if you're gonna ask somebody like that, they're gonna be like, well, no, it's actually like even greater that the God that we serve is making his will come about in spite of these things, and like working with genuinely free creatures that are fallen and all this other stuff. So that's like typically my return on that, but yeah. Okay, so in terms of providence here, then there's a few different views. Well, actually, let's answer that question, because for me, it's like, if you're going to ask me the question, which kind of universe did God create, that open theist, Molinist, or Calvinistic universe, I think intuitively it's going to be the Molinist or open theist universes that are going to be instantiated over the Calvinistic one. At least for me, it makes more sense, because those types of worlds are going to be way more valuable on the whole than the Calvinistic one. But what are your thoughts?
So when the little book about a big God comes out, I've got a whole chapter where I go through all three of these views, and I start out with going, I don't know. and now let me explain why I don't know. And I run through all these different arguments
Fair enough.
because, and part of it is me just trying to figure out my own thinking on it. But yeah, so because you have to make these different value judgments, and I don't know how to weigh them all up at the moment.
Yeah.
So when I'm looking at a Calvinist universe, one of the things you get is you can get a clear guarantee that the universe is going to go exactly the way God wants it to.
Mm-hmm.
And will all things be well in the end? And the Calvinist is going to go, yeah, because God's going to causally determine how absolutely everything unfolds. So you get this absolute sovereignty. And well, not absolute, because sovereignty is, everybody's got sovereignty. You get this absolute control of exactly how things are going to go, and God can guarantee in advance he's going to get what he wants, exactly what he wants. And that seems like a value. And I don't want to deny that, because that really is valuable. Do I think it's always fully coherent when they want to say, well, you also have free will in that story? I want to go, that doesn't make any sense. But I don't want to deny that this is like a clear value that you would have from a Calvinist universe, is this absolute divine control and a guaranteed outcome that God's going to get exactly what he wants.
Yeah.
That's a big one.
Yeah. It is difficult to kind of carry out these value judgments, because one of the things I always harp on, especially within the problem of evil literatures, like this myth of shared axiology. Like, everybody's going to have a different view of axiology and what they value, and the value judgments they make, and then the meta-normative, like, action informing, like, aspects of these things. So that's really hard.
It is.
That's really hard. So when I say to me, more than likely it's the Calvinist, not the Calvinist one, but the open theist / Molinist one, it's just based off of the way I understand axiology. Well, so let me caveat it that way, if that helps. So yeah, go ahead. Go ahead if you want to say something.
So if you grant that all three of these theories of providence are coherent, internally coherent, that they really do give you God being sovereign and God and humans having free will. If they give you that, well, then the Molinist is going to go, well, then I can get all of that too. So this Calvinist, you think you've got a point in your favor. Well, I have that. I can check that too. Yeah. And then I've written several papers, one with my wife on molecular biology and open theism, where we go, if God puts risk management systems into the world, well, then he can guarantee the outcome as well. So all three of them get that check mark of can God get exactly what he wants or get the outcome he wants? Yes. All three of them can check that if they are all coherent. Yes. That's the thing.
And then do you find any incoherence in any of them?
Yes. So with the Calvinist, trying to figure out how compatibilism works. So the claim is free will is whatever free will is. So a lot of people will want to say free will means you're the source of your actions. A lot of people will also want to add in, you have the ability to do otherwise, with not every single thing, but with a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
And when you even look at the older Calvinists, they say the same stuff. They say the same thing. That's what free will is. Some of the more contemporary ones will deny that, but back in the olden days with the old Calvinists, they'll be like, yeah, that's what free will is. Then there's the next question is free will compatible with being determined? And your average Calvinist wants to say, yes, it is. So God can causally determine you to act the way that you act, causally determine you to have the reasons that you have for your actions, causally determine you to think the way that you think, all that stuff. Yeah. And you still have free will. That's the claim.
So I have my issues with compatibilism, but this might just be my ignorance of the Calvinistic side of the literature on this stuff coming out. But I actually just can't make sense of theological determinism if there's an immaterial self as well.
Explain that a bit.
Yeah. So, for instance, when I think of determinism, I think of it in terms of I like to make a distinction between determinism and necessity, for instance, right?
Yeah.
And so, for me at least, it seems like determinism is a type of material thing versus an immaterial thing. So for the immaterial self to be determined to do something, it doesn't make sense to me. The options on the table are I'm gonna God saying I'm gonna create a specific person that's gonna desire these things at all times. Maybe that might be the case, but that even then I have a hard time making sense of that because it's just
yeah.
Sorry, I not to open up another can of worms, but
it's a short can of worms though. So if you Simon Kittle and Lee Weissens have this really good, very short little book called God and Human Freedom. It's one of the Cambridge Elements books, so it's only like 60 pages, and I think it's like $20. But I've also you could at one point you're able
to, it was free at one point.
Exactly,
I it, so
yes,
I have it.
It's
I just
it's
haven't read
really
it yet.
good. So because Lee, she's done a whole lot of work on theological determinism. That was what her PhD was on.
Okay.
And then her and Peter Furlong have a book coming out sometime soon. I think it's a collection of essays on theological determinism.
Okay.
So one of the things they do that Lee and Simon do in this short little book, God and Human Freedom, is they articulate different kinds of determinism, and then talk about different Calvinists what they think. So some determinists will say, yeah, God uses natural determinism, like in the physical processes. And that's what you're just describing. And some others go, no, not at all. God could determine absolutely everything, but he didn't have to do it through. He could do it through an indeterministic physical processes. I find that weird. But I just, at least they name people who affirm these things, so it's at least a combination of views to consider. How to make sense of it, I couldn't make sense of it entirely. And my wife actually wanted us to write a follow-up paper where we argue that it's not possible. Like if God's really going to be fully determinate, then the kind of indeterministic processes you see in the world, those would have to be purely illusory. Like they just wouldn't make sense. For God to create a world where you've got seemingly indeterministic processes, because they wouldn't really actually be indeterminate.
Yeah, that's weird. Okay.
Yeah, so it's weird, but there's people who affirm it. And
so do you generally share my concerns on that too, then, or? Okay.
To some extent, not so much though with the immaterial stuff, because what you have is this much older claim of universal divine causality, where God is the direct and immediate cause of everything. Full stop. So your existence, you having the powers that you have, and then your thoughts and your actions are also things that exist. And so God's the direct and immediate cause of your thoughts and your actions. And that could all be immaterial. Because even someone like Barclay, I almost said Charles Barclay, Bishop Barclay, he was an idealist. There's no physical world, but he's an occasionalist. So he thinks that God's the only causal agent. So God's directly causing everything. And it's just a fully immaterial world, but it's a fully determined world.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, well, let's go back to the compatibilism thing then, because there's a lot to think about on that, and that I'm just not. I haven't looked into. That's all. So for me, at least, I can't make sense of compatibilism. What are your thoughts? Why you seem to say it's not coherent?
I don't think it's coherent, but when I'm reading through like Peter Furlong's book, like the philosophical challenges of divine determinism, man, he gives you a run for your money. He really does. Like he's like, well, you might think this is a problem for compatibilism, but here's like 20 kind of arguments I could run. And then you go through all of them and you're like, okay, next problem. He's like, yeah, here's like 15 more like things I could say. And I'm like, okay. So like you gotta do your work. You can't just be like, that's dumb. Like, he really makes you like, you gotta work for it, which I actually really like. It's just really good. So some of the moves you can make is you could say there's different theories of free will. So you don't have to go with this idea that free will means you've got the ability to do otherwise. What you could say is freedom is reason responsiveness. So you act freely when you respond to appropriate reasons. You don't need the ability to do otherwise. And so a lot of people will say, well, that's fine. That's compatible with God determining everything. He just determines that you have certain reasons. Well, then you're free because you act on those reasons. And I'm like, okay, cool. So maybe let's allow that's coherent for the second, so we can get into another problem that's related to this. This is one that Dirk Pereboom brings up, and Dirk Pereboom himself is a theological determinist. So God gives me the reasons that I have to act. You might start worrying, okay, well, that applies all across the board. So Prigozhin, he was like, screw Putin. I'm going to try to like overthrow the Russian government. And it failed. And everybody's predicting, well, he's probably going to mysteriously fall out a window soon, because that's what happens to former Russian leaders, is they mysteriously fall out of a window. Well, his plane just got shot down. Well, so you're going to say, well, okay, well, Putin, where did those reasons for doing all these things that he did, like throwing people out, ordering people to be thrown out windows, ordering this plane to get shot down, where did those reasons come from? Well, God, because God causes all the reasons for why you act. Okay, well, this Ukrainian war is pretty awful. It's evil. It's terrible. It's disgusting. I hate everything about it. But why are the people acting the way that they are? Well, God gave them those reasons. Now it starts to look like, I think it was Schleiermacher who said this. Now it looks like we've got some element of the demonic in God.
Mm-hmm.
That
we don't want that.
No, not at all. No, nothing of the sort. And that, I think, is a serious problem.
Yeah. No, that's one of my. Well, I haven't actually looked at it from that angle before, in terms of cashing out freedom in that way and then running the problem of evil in that fashion. But that's typically one of my issues with Calvinism in general. It's just the way that it has to deal with the problem of evil in general.
Yeah, there's moves you can make from there, though. Like James Anderson, has done a lot of work trying to figure out where to go from there. Another strategy, I'm not going to name names because I don't want to name and shame too much. But there's another common strategy I've seen from some pretty prominent Calvinists, is what I'll call a conveniently incomplete story. So this is something you do in philosophy a lot, where you'll give a thought experiment to try to pump people's intuitions, and then your story is just incomplete at the parts where the obvious problems would pop up. And you're like, well, there's no incoherence in my story because I didn't give you the full story.
I didn't finish it. Yeah.
So what you can do is you can say, well, yeah, God determines everything. And you're like, okay, cool. How does that work? And you're like, oh, there's lots of things that we could mean by determinism. And there's lots of ways God could determine things. And you're like, okay, so how does he do it? And you're like, oh, yeah, there's lots of things. And you just
his ways are higher than our ways.
Yeah. You just start playing the mystery card and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, no. Give me the old fashioned Calvinist who just says, how does God know the future? Because he causally determines everything that's going to happen. Otherwise, he will not know it. So give me William Shedd just saying the only reason God knows things is because he's causally determined it all. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, now I got a nice, neat story that I can assess as true or false.
Gotcha. Huh. You gave me some fun stuff to think about, even with the topic of freedom, because typically, like, the concept of divine freedom that I kind of hold to is that just like it is in terms of powers and liabilities. It's just like God has no liabilities, so he actually is like the true truly free, whereas we have like limited amounts of freedom compared to God, kind of a thing.
Yeah,
at least that's the working model that I have at the moment.
I think something like that's right, and your average Calvinist is going to agree. They're going to be like, yeah, God's got all the absolute freedom. He really can do A or not A. He's got all this, like, we don't have that. We don't have that.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so we're at an hour and 20 so far. Where do you want to go from here before we start taking questions or anything like that?
Well, I don't know, because maybe just see what people have, because we could talk about the open theism more if you want. But yeah, who knows? I don't know what people
could open up a book of worms, because like we could dig into the biblical data, but somebody actually even already asked a few questions related. Okay, but I'll go down the list here. Okay, so one of my favorite atheist friends, Dylan's, asks, wouldn't an A3 block of time imply that the past and future are either semantical or purely relational?
Not necessarily. So when you're looking at like all the block theories of the universe, it's so like Tim Maudlin will just point out, he's like, all these are purely substantival. They're not relational, because you're talking about there's a block, a substance, space-time. It's a thing. And he thinks that carries over from special on into the general theory of relativity. So if you get Tim Maudlin has two different books. One's called the metaphysics within physics, and then another one more recently, I think it's just called the philosophy of space and time, or the philosophy of physics, that came out more recently. And so he'll go through all this sort of stuff in a lot more detail. But that's the short answer.
Fair enough. Okay. Kevin Non-Tradiketh. I learned how to say it.
Oh, because I was looking. I was like, I don't know. You're really tempted when reading that last name to say like traditionalist or something like that, or like non-traditional Catholic or something like that. And I think this is in reference to our Truthmaker stuff. Mm.
He says, so like, does nominalism kind of solve all this propositional stuff?
No, because you'll find a lot of people who will say propositions don't exist, but we have sentences, and we still need something that explains why these sentences are true. Um, where you do get in trouble, though, this is something that Ulrich Mayer points out, is the truthmaker theory seemed like it was really neutral on a lot of this stuff. Like it's supposed to be just like this really neutral arbiter to figuring out metaphysics. And he'll point out like, okay, well, what makes the apple red? And you'd be like, well, the apple has the property of being red. Well, you've already lost nominalism now because the nominalists can't explain it. And then Mayer will go, actually, you need a little bit more than that. You need something to start introducing states of affairs. You might introduce tropes. You might have to introduce, and you start introducing all these things just in order to get something as simple as the apple is red is true. And he's like, whoa, we have gone off the charts of like all sorts of like heavy-handed metaphysics just to make this. This is not a neutral theory anymore. This truth-making theory is not neutral. So nominalism, a lot of nominalists will say we can give you the truth makers, but I don't know. I just think it's a deeper problem for truth maker theory, I guess.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay. What if we hold? I don't. Some kind of Russian person name. It looks Russian at least.
It's Australian, yeah.
Okay. What if we hold to atomic truthmaker theory and then work out something from which tensed propositions can be ground on? I actually don't know what atomic truthmaker theory is, to be honest with you. So
there's these really fine-grained distinctions within propositions, where you can have like an atomic proposition where it's like the simplest one. It's like apple is red or something like that, where it's not like a conjunction of a bunch of other stuff. So let me think about this question again. So what if we hold to atomic truthmaker theory and then work out something from which tense propositions can be grounded on? This is a project, at least I'm not certain I understand exactly the question, but there's been a long ongoing project where people will try to hold truthmaker theory and then say the tenseless theory of time is true, but it can ground all the tensed propositions. So this has been a huge project. Hugh Meller started this project like ages ago, and people have been trying to work on it since then. It's super technical. I just don't think it works because when I think about the proposition, I'm sad right now. What am I sad about? I'm sad about present facts. No tenseless facts could ground that. I don't think that I'm sad about tenseless facts. I'm sad about what's happening right now. Yeah.
right.
Ollie Pearson has a really good book called, I think it's like Time, Rationality, Emotions, and Self, something like that, where you get all the technical details on how that argument's supposed to go.
Awesome. Okay. He also asks if we hold to the. Okay, so I'm assuming this is in reference to the prior to creation stuff we were talking about, where God doesn't know what's going to happen. If I'm wrong in that assumption in your question, correct me. But he says, if we hold to that, shouldn't we be subscribing to the
principle? I'm assuming.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I was trying to be like, what is that word? Because for me, it's like law. Of excluded middle, since in that logical moment, the proposition about what God will do isn't true nor false.
Maybe there's different logical systems of how this goes. So I can't summarize it quickly, but Patrick Todd's recent book called The Open Future lays out all the semantics and the logic you need in order to affirm excluded middle. So you don't have to get rid of excluded middle. And you have this view that's called all falsism, where all the propositions about the future are false. You still got excluded middle because what it might be true or it might not be true. That's where you can start, where the excluded middle can start coming into play. But it's more technical than I can explain it right now.
Yeah, you would probably need a whiteboard or something.
Yeah.
You can't do propositional logic and like first order logic and logic.
but yeah, the answer to the question is, if this all falsism view is true, you can keep the law of excluded middle. But there are other views of the open future where you completely get rid of excluded middle. And you have to introduce like some more truth values and stuff. I don't like those, but those are options you can do.
Awesome. All right. All right. This is going to be fun stuff that we can get into. How would Dr. Mullins apply this to prophecies? Since I inserted the word "since" there. Didn't God know that such and such event would happen in the future?
Okay, so say you're a Calvinist and you go, right, I'll like you'll be like a John Feinberg Calvinist where you're like really intellectually honest, and you go, yeah, before God decides anything, he doesn't know the future. But once God decides, well, then he knows everything because he's the one deciding this is the timeline I want. So all the prophecies, everything, that's all going to fall into place. So it's, again, the Calvinist claim is um, God's free knowledge, what he's freely decided to do, his knowledge of what he's freely decided to do, that grounds his foreknowledge. So that's how the Calvinist would go.
Mhm.
If you're a Molinist, you actually end up saying the exact same thing. And if you're an open theist, you've got some options. One could be he knows such and such events will happen in the future because he's going to determine that they'll happen. Because a lot of open theists will say, if God needs to, he can just override people's freedom and just do some unilateral actions here or there. The other options could be a lot of these prophecies are conditional. So like the Jonah prophecies, Jonah doesn't say that it's conditional, but the people clearly take it to be. And there's a lot of commentators who will say Jonah didn't tell them that it was that like repent or be destroyed. He just told them you'll be destroyed because he hated the Ninevites so much that he's just like, screw you. No, just you'll be destroyed.
I just kind of adding on to that, especially for the people that have watched my video on Jonah. Because I made a video talking about the chaos traditions embedded in the Jonah story. And I think it's Amos, because Jonah shows up in another place in the Hebrew Bible where he prophesies in favor of King Nebuchadnezzar II, and then Amos comes around and gives a counter prophecy against King Nebuchadnezzar II. So that's just kind of adding on to this conditionality / like openness of these prophecies as well. So.
Yeah, and you'll see this in a lot of Old Testament scholars. We'll talk about the conditionality of it. It can also be the case, though, that some prophecies, it's just because when the open theist says, like, God doesn't know the future, there's a lot more qualifications to it. God knows all the possible ways the future could unfold, and he also knows the objective probability of each way the future could unfold. So it might be the case that some of them, the probability is just so high that you could... Okay, I think that there'd be a bunch of cases where the probability is so high it's certain. It's just it's a 1 or 100%. Some open theists really hate that. They don't like, no, it could never be 100%. And I'm like, I don't know. I feel like I'm pretty predictable. That God really could go, yeah, I know with absolute certainty Ryan's going to do that. Like,
for me, I'm totally fine with that. Especially when you just like, not to get really rhetorical here, but it's like, this is God you're talking about. It's if you have somebody who's got all the knowledge that's possible and all the power that's possible, and he has an intention about what he's going to do in the future, he's going to make it happen. So I know that's really rhetorical, but it's
I think it's right, because there's a lot of times when I'm taking my students through the different views and we're looking at open theism, I'm like, remember, like on open theism, God's not an idiot, like he's going to figure it out. Like he's going to put in plans in place. Like, come on. Like,
exactly. Hot take, I actually think open theism makes more sense of the phenomena of scripture than like a Calvinistic one does. I think the Molinist does an equally good job too. But so it's just interesting how like crazy and like intertwined all of this is with your basic theology.
It really is. Yeah. And that's something I didn't know when I first started going down this whole God and time stuff, like, about 20 years ago.
Yeah. Systematic theology is fun. Okay. This guy asks again. I don't even know why I tried reading it. I've seen Dr. Ryan argue that one of the reasons for God to create is friendship, but there were friendships before creation, the intra-Trinitarian friendship. So what would the response be?
Yeah. So this is a part of the next big like project I'm working on, is why, like, looking at all the different models of God and figuring out why would God create anything at all, and then why this particular universe, because it introduces this huge network of issues that I'm still just trying to identify. So one reason when you're looking through, I think, the Gospel of John, the reason that's quite explicit is God wants to be friends with us. And that's the claim, is like, that's why I sent you. That's why I created you. And you're like, woo, okay. Well, just because there's friendship among the Trinitarian persons, that's one value that God would want. Friendship with creatures is a completely separate value. And so that could be a reason to create. Would it be like a fully so there's a difference between what's called a justifying reason and a requiring reason,
Yeah.
or a decisive reason. So a justifying reason is just like you've got a reason to do this, like it's a good reason to do it. You
Yeah.
don't have to though. Like, you wouldn't be irrational if you didn't do it.
Yeah.
Whereas like a requiring or a decisive reason is like you have to do it. Like rationality demands that you do this.
Yeah.
I think creating humans in order to enter into friendship with them is a justifying reason, because God would not be irrational to not do that, precisely for the thing that you point out, which is inner Trinitarian friendship. Like, I've already got that. I've already got that kind of friendship. Do they want a different kind of friendship with a different kind of being? That'd be cool. So cool that I have to create them? No, but it'd be pretty cool.
Yeah.
I think that's how it goes.
Yeah, my response is something like that as well, and I usually just kind of give my own self as an analogy, right? It's like, well, my wife and I are in a friendship and a relationship, but it's like
Mhm.
that wasn't the reason to not create three more kids, right?
Mhm.
So we had a reason to have three more kids, and we decided to do that. We also have a reason to not have any more. I'm done. But
Mhm.
but so it's like in the same sense, it's like, well, yeah, God's in this intertrinitarian friendship, but that doesn't mean that there's not a reason to create
Mhm.
more friends of a different kind, even. So,
Right.
and especially of a different type of friendship. I think that's another thing that you can look into.
I think that's important, is we're looking at certain kinds of values that could not exist otherwise.
Yeah.
And God creature friendship is a value that cannot exist without God creating stuff.
Yeah. And there's even more. Like I like the stuff Swinburne does in this kind of stuff too. It's just like, well, the type of thing that we are, right, is very different than the type of thing God is within this Trinitarian like friendship.
Mhm.
And there's, like you said just now, there's a different type of value that comes about with this infinite God being, or this maximal God being friends with these very finite beings that are weak and broken and all this other stuff. So um, that wasn't a question. I don't know why that was started, but I'm still trying to grasp relativity isn't the king. Um, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, I mean, there's this thing called quantum mechanics that contradicts it all. And so trying to figure out how to reconcile the two. I mean, that's just like the big ongoing project of physics.
yeah. Okay. Jacob asks, oh, I think I know who this guy is too. Um, does God determine the consequences of sin, or does he foreknow because he knows the outcomes of contingent actions?
It depends on your theory of providence.
Yeah.
So if you're a Calvinist, you're going to say, well, God definitely determines the consequences, because he's determining the whole story. If you're a Molinist, you've got some options. You could say it's because God determines the consequences, or he just foreknows that just happens to be what the outcome of this particular action is. That's just the way that particular timeline just goes. You've got some options there. Whereas an open theist, again, I think you could do the same, because it could be the case that some of the consequences. So you see this like unfold in the Old Testament. God says, if you do this,
Yeah.
Israel, I am going to make sure that these things happen. And you're like,
Yeah.
oh gosh. Whereas for the rest of us, my guess is a lot of other times, if we're living in an open universe, a lot of other times God's just like, that's just what happens when you do these terrible things. That's just I just know that it's the outcome of contingent actions.
Yeah. All right. Once God freely decided to make humans, doesn't he then get the knowledge of what the people will do, and therefore if they go to heaven or hell?
It kind of, it depends. So if you're a Calvinist, you're going to say his decision of who goes to heaven or hell, that actually somehow comes prior to his decision to freely create this universe. So he's going to be deciding not on anything about you or what you will do or what you could do, nothing about you at all. He decides whether or not you're going to heaven or hell. So it's an unconditional election. Um,
Mhm.
and then once he makes the decision of like, yeah, that guy, screw him, he's going to hell. This guy, yeah, you're cool. You're well, not you're cool, but like you just are going to heaven.
Yeah.
Then God knows it. Whereas the Molinist is going to try to go, maybe there's a lot more wiggle room here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. A few more questions. Is there
Mhm.
any book or paper that talks about different reasons for God creating? Swinburne, the existence of God.
He talks about it a bit. So I'm trying to catalog a bunch of these things right now. So I've got a paper called, oh gosh, what is it? The book's way over there. I can't grab it. It's this new book out on panentheism in Indian and Western philosophy. And what I do in my paper in there is I look at this argument from Jainist philosophers against Hindu philosophers. So it's against the existence of God. Because a lot of Hindu philosophers would give these cosmological and design arguments for the existence of God. All of those assume God has a reason for creating. Yeah. And so what the Jaina does is she goes, why does God create? Because if God doesn't have a reason, then all of your arguments for the existence of God, they fall apart. And so they outline 6 different reasons for why God would create. And they argue that none of those work. And so I try to go through all 6 of those reasons to go, what could you say if you're going to be a panentheist? Like, why would God create? William Hasker has some discussion on this in his book. I think it's called God, Evil, or The Openness of God and Evil, something like this. It's one of his earlier books on evil. Keith Ward talks about it in a bunch of different places. There's a new book out on holiness by Mark Murphy. And like, there's a whole chapter on just trying to give reasons why God would not create, which is odd. And then Mark Johnston has this really interesting paper that you can find, I think, on his website. And it's called Why Did the One Not Remain in Itself? And it's all about just what would God's reasons be for creating. Those are some places you can go. I give you a more bigger list, but that's that's some places awesome to go.
All right, last question. Why would God create imperfection just to make it perfect again, referring to him making humans that ultimately go to heaven?
This we should do a follow-up episode on this question at some point, because I've got a whole lecture that I do for my class at the University of Lucerne just on this issue. The long story short is I think it's logically impossible for God to create perfect beings.
I actually agree with that.
Yeah.
So,
but yeah,
that's what I wanted to talk to you about off screen.
Yeah.
So cool.
But that's let's just do a follow-up episode on that, because
that'll be
I need
fun.
to unpack some things.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. I think that's the last question. Do you have any parting thoughts? Do you have the website? Is there a website or anything for you to plug the master's program or anything like that? So you can like share your screen with or anything?
Well, actually, I don't have it with me right now, and it's insanely long. So the website is, but if you just Google, it's called the Master Filter Program, because it's the Masters of Arts in Philosophy, Theology, and Religions at the University of Lucerne in Switzerland. And yeah, like I said, it's just got this like all-star cast of different scholars in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam who have created the courses, and then a bunch of really great people like myself who create the courses and also are doing the tutoring for the program. And so right now, like the term is different than a American academic school calendar. There we go. That's it.
Yep.
Yeah. So the school year is actually about to come to a close. Like all their papers are due on Friday. They're due tomorrow. Whereas everybody else is starting school. But I've got people doing really cool stuff. Like one of my students is doing Descartes' ontological argument for the existence of God. I've got another student looking at the Jesus mythicism stuff and just going like, nah, come on. The historical Jesus is way better than this. I've got another student doing stuff on science and religion. I've got someone who's like wanting to work on like theology and mental health. Like it's really cool stuff.
That'll be interesting. Yeah,
there's a lot of cool stuff going on. So it's good.
Cool. Yeah. So if you guys are looking to get into a master's program, or you know somebody, check it out. Because I can't recommend Mullins enough. So yeah, check it out. Somebody asked just, can we find Dr. Mullins? I mean, is that physically?
So come to Philadelphia and get on the corner of 2nd and Market Street, count to 10, and then we'll play hide and seek. And then
there you go.
Yeah.
I'm assuming they're talking about like just everything. You can look up his name, like to find his written literature. He has books.
If you go to my website, is rtmullins.com, and I've got a lot of my papers up there. Not all of them, but because I can't put all of them up, but I can put a lot of them up. And some of them I shouldn't put up, but I did anyway, because I was like, screw you, I don't care about the copyright issue. So
fair enough.
I want people to read this thing.
You also have a podcast.
So I've got the Reluctant
Theologian.
There we go.
but here's the website.
Oh, I forgot that my wife she put up some new pictures and stuff. She was playing with it. So yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So the website, rtmullins.com, has all this stuff, the podcast, books, yada, yada, yada. So yeah, go check out his work. It's you and a few others are the people that have like influenced me crazy. So yeah, awesome. Well, thanks, Dr. Mullins, for coming on. I'm actually really excited now for the next stream where we're talking about why it's logically impossible for God to create perfect beings. Because yeah, cool. Thank you everybody for listening. Until next time, God bless. And just a friendly reminder again, we're in this fundraising push right now. We're trying to raise some extra money so that way I can keep making better content for you guys, more frequent content. And I'm also going to be fundraising because in fall 2024, we're going to have a first Exploring Reality conference. More news on that later. So catch you all later. God bless. I pressed the wrong button.